This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Hello, this is Sriram Panyam for Software Engineering Radio. Today I have with me Carson Gross, the creator of HTMX, a library that's challenging how we're thinking about modern web development and by returning to the hypermedia-driven principles of the early web, and all the while delivering modern user experiences. Welcome to the show, Carson.
Thank you. Very excited to be here. It's really nice to be able to talk on a show that's a little bit more geared towards software engineering and sort of like principles instead of just like, here's another, here's how HTMX works. So I'm excited to talk about sort of the philosophy and software engineering around it.
Sounds great. Before we dive into the details of HTMX, I want to get your perspective on the current state of web development. These days, web development seems to involve a lot of complexity, complex tooling, complex frameworks. Could you share your perspective on where it's at?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, obviously, I wouldn't have created HTMX, which we'll get into the details of exactly how it works later. But it is a simpler, I think, way of creating at least a certain class or a certain percentage of web applications. And I think, as you point out, in the last, say, 10, 15 years, web development has gotten pretty complicated. Part of that was driven by needs. Obviously, if you need a more sophisticated user interface, things get more complicated. But I think a part of it, too, is just driven by developers. We have a hard time saying no to things and, the shiny new thing and being impressed by sophisticated approaches rather than maybe accepting a little bit less sizzle, but with a simpler approach. And so I think it's been a mix of those things. I don't think I'm alone in suggesting in modern web development, which is really, I think, the main area HTMX is interesting, is pretty complicated now. There are a lot of people that are very good at it and experts at it. And I don't want to denigrate what they can do and what they can achieve with the tools they have. But at the same time, I do think there's a large class of web applications in particular that could be simplified using some of these older ideas.
Nice. And in terms of these challenges, where and how does hypermedia-driven approach come in? I mean, first of all, what is it?
Yeah, let's talk about what the hypermedia approach is. So HTMX is what I call a hypermedia-driven library. And what that means is that it uses the ideas of hypermedia, which are very old. I mean, the term was coined back in the 1960s. And obviously, the web was invented in the 1990s. So you're talking about some pretty old ideas at this point. But with HTMX, the idea is let's take those ideas and sort of extend them. And really the big idea, I would say, in hypermedia is this notion of what's called a hypermedia control. What makes hypermedia interesting from a technical standpoint is that you mix control information and display information in a single document. And I don't know if, like Ted Nelson wouldn't probably talk about it in that way, but I'm taking my terminology from Roy Fielding's dissertation. He had a famous dissertation about REST. It was describing the web. And I've written a paper, an ACM paper that you can read called Generalizing Hypermedia Controls that sort of riffs on this idea. But again, to get back to your original question, a hypermedia is a media, so some format that sort of display content like we're used to when we talk about media. But then it has these special things called hypermedia controls mixed in. And so the canonical hypermedia control is the anchor tag. And so you put an anchor tag in an HTML document, and then someone clicks on it and they go somewhere else. And that doesn't seem like much probably to you or me because we're so used to the web. But from a historical perspective, what you're doing is you're putting control information in the document. You're putting navigation in the document itself. And that's really what makes it a hypermedia, something that's beyond normal media. So when the term hypermedia was coined, Nelson was contrasting it with like books and, magazines and things like this, where you just kind of plodded through it directly. And I think the informal definition that he gave was basically any sort of media that needs to be consumed on a computer, because computers allow you to have these interactive experiences. So again, from my perspective as a computer scientist, I really focus in on this notion of hypermedia controls. We talked about links. The other major hypermedia control that's available in HTML, which is a hypermedia format, is our forms. And so if your listeners have ever created a form in HTML, to submit, a contact or something like that, or just filled out like everyone has experience with a credit card form at this point and click submit. And then you purchase something. That's different. That actually forms were added in HTML2. And it was really a pretty massive and a step forward in the ideas of hypermedia, which hasn't been discussed a whole bunch because hypermedia before that wasn't always, but it didn't have this explicit notion of reading and writing. So hypermedia before the form tag, again, there was a bunch of different hypermedia systems. So I don't want to say universally, but it was very tightly associated with the notion of navigation, like clicking hyperlinks. But when forms came along in HTML2, that really transformed the web as a hypermedia system, as a system built on top of hypermedia, from a read-only system, which is what it was initially designed as, a way to share research documents at CERN, into a potential web application, or like a potential application mechanism. And so we sort of stumbled around for the next 10 to 15 years figuring out, okay, how are we going to build web apps and model view controller? How does that apply to the web? And so on and so forth. So I think if someone's like, okay, what is a hypermedia? What I'm going to tell them, the one sentence answer is it's a media, something that displays media in some way that also allows you to encode actions in or control actions via hypermedia controls in it.
Interesting.
So, and that's sort of what the web was. I'm so sorry I got off on a tangent there, but that was the history of the web. And then what HTMX does is it takes those ideas and sort of extends them.
So that's pretty good context. How does that either relate or conflict with the RESTful approaches that, Roy's dissertation brought us 20 years ago?
Yeah. So I think what you're referring to is Roy Fielding's famous dissertation at the University of Irvine, which gave us the term in chapter 5 of that dissertation, gave us the term REST, which stands for representational state transfer. And that document, it takes a network perspective, like a network architecture perspective, and defines the RESTful network architecture in terms of a series of constraints. I have to say, I don't think there was as much focus in it. I mean, it was his dissertation. He was concerned about network architecture, just not his real thing. But I focus much more on hypermedia controls as the interesting part of it. And so basically in that dissertation, he gave, there's a series of 5 constraints, I think, and a 6th optional one that define whether or not a system is RESTful. The most important of those constraints on a network architecture, I think, is what's called the uniform interface constraint. And that is, it's the last one before the optional scripting constraint. Basically, what he noted about hypermedia, one thing that's interesting about it is because you encode the control actions directly in the media that are returned from the server, it has this very unique characteristic as just a way to build distributed systems in that clients, and here client means browsers, don't need to know in advance how a website works. Instead, they enter the website through a URL. And then as you interact with that website, all of the actions that you take are discovered through the HTML or the hypermedia is what I would say that is returned from that system. And so that's called a uniform interface because the client, the browser in this case, can interact with any website regardless of its domain. So if the website is a car sales website, or if it's a hospital or bank, or if it's a coffee shop or whatever, the browser doesn't know any of those concepts. It doesn't know what a coffee shop is or anything like that. And the network communications with that system are all done in terms of hypermedia. So this browser has this kind of crazy characteristic to it where it's a universal client because there's this hypermedia that provides a uniform interface to access that system. And another aspect of this that I think is sometimes overlooked with this uniform interface of hypermedia is that you can dramatically change a website. And if I go to it, I don't need to update my app to use it. I don't have to update to the current version of the API. Instead, your website or web application, however you want to think about it, just returns, here are the current things you can do. And then I select the actions from those responses. And so the RESTful approach that Fielding was pointing out has this really nice characteristic where if you're doing it properly, then you don't have to worry about versioning your network API as much because of just this nice characteristic of the uniform interface of hypermedia. It's kind of ironic. I don't know if you've read, I have an essay on the HTMX website called How Did REST Come to Mean the Opposite of REST? Because today, if people use the term REST, they're typically talking about JSON format APIs. And those are actually, they're very unrestful for the most part. And I don't mean that in a moral sense. I'm not saying they're bad for not being restful, but they're just from a descriptive standpoint, they're not, if you take the original definition of that seriously, mainly because they don't communicate in terms of a hypermedia, which has this uniform interface aspect to it. So it's an interesting, if your listeners are interested, they can go read that essay on the htmx.org/essays website. It's called How Did REST Come to Mean the Opposite of REST?
In a way, I mean, what I'm hearing is with hypermedia, it's kind of user-centric in that the user, the client will come in there and do things on that site or on that application without necessarily knowing or needing to care about the modeling of those things behind it, right? Which sounds like what REST might be more focused on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Unfortunately, I find it's often difficult to communicate that properly to people because particularly when today, we've specialized in many ways into sort of front end and back end. And so the front end people think in terms of libraries like React and so forth. And the back end people think in terms of what they consider an API. And what they consider an API is typically what I would call a data API, an RPC style data API. Maybe not RPC, there's RESTful aspects to it. But at the end of the day, they're not returning hypermedia. And when you suggest, hey, here's this other approach, they often are flabbergasted and say that's a horrible API because it's my UI. I'm coupling my API to my UI. And they're right. I mean, they're not wrong. At the end of the day, when you're returning hypermedia, at some level, you're returning the UI. So what I would say about that is it's coupled at the application level. Now, on the other hand, I think one thing that's interesting to think about is this fact that the browser doesn't need to be updated when you change your website if you use hypermedia. And so, whereas if you're using a JSON API and you have an SPA or something like that, then you do have to, or maybe to make it even more explicit, like a mobile client, a thick application that's talking to a JSON API. If you change your JSON API, you have to change your client too. And so at some level, those two things are actually more tightly coupled. They're more tightly coupled than the pure web application is. I think, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but the way I interpret Fielding's, the way Fielding talks about this stuff, and certainly the way I think about it, is that what is happening there is that REST decouples client and server at the network architecture level, not at the application level. And so you couple yourself more tightly at the application level, but by doing that, you actually decouple lower down. And so you get this nice characteristic where if you change what your endpoints return, then to a first order approximation anyways, you don't have to update the client being the browser in any major way. I think that's an interesting sort of, for the listeners of this podcast that are interested in software engineering, I think that's an interesting thing to think about because it appears that there are different meanings of coupling. And the fact that when you change a JSON API, you have to change the client, even though the JSON API feels more generic at some level, implies there's some coupling going on there, right? That's sort of the definition thereof. And so I think it's something that software engineers should think about because it's just an interesting characteristic of REST.
Right. No, that helps with the context of HTMX, right? I mean, so how does HTMX take this and extend it, and what was the origin story of this?
Right. Origin story is actually very practical. I was trying to sort a table and I was doing it in 2010. So a long time ago. And I was doing it in JavaScript on the client side because that's what all the cool kids were doing at that point. I was using jQuery and I was just having a bear of a time making it go fast enough. And I just couldn't, on the browsers of the time, which didn't have the highly optimized JavaScript runtimes that we have today, it wouldn't sort quickly enough. And so out of desperation, I tried this trick that jQuery had a method, I think called load, on jQuery. So if you're an old jQuery person, you can look that up. And what that does is it takes a URL and then puts the result into an element in the DOM, just issues an HTTP GET request and then puts it into the DOM. So I tried that again, just sort of out of desperation. And lo and behold, it was instant. I could sort it really quickly. And I think that was an artifact of the JavaScript runtimes of the time. Everything was kind of bad this, way back in the day. But I found out you could do that and was like, oh, this is cool. And so I started building up some tools around that method. And then I saw, I don't know how familiar your listeners are with web development, but Angular 1, when Angular 1 came out, they used attributes in HTML to drive behavior. And I didn't like the way that they were doing it, but I like that idea of like, let's use attributes. That's because, okay, I have an href and an anchor tag, and now I've got my own little thing that does something different. And so I started mixing sort of these ideas together into a helper library that I was using. And then I eventually released that helper library as a library called intercooler.js. And that was in 2013 is when I finally released it. And when I did that, I started getting people emailing me and saying, hey, this is cool. This is RESTful. And at the time, I didn't understand REST like nowhere near as well as I understand it now. I hope, anyways, as I understand it now. But I went back and I'd read Fielding's thesis, but not, that much. I didn't understand a lot of it. I didn't understand what the uniform interface was. But I slowly over time recognized, okay, this library is actually, it's RESTful. It's actually, I would go further and say it's hypermedia oriented. Like that's what makes this library distinct from other options like, say, React or Angular was the big thing at the time or whatever. And so what I came to understand, and if you go to the HTMX.org website, you can see sort of like in the introduction, what I came to understand is that an HTMX, I'm sorry, I should just mention, HTMX is a rewrite of jQuery, of intercooler,
yes.
Because intercooler.js depended on jQuery. So HTMX is a standalone library. It doesn't depend on jQuery because the JavaScript runtimes have come so far. But if you go to htmx.org and you look at the introduction, there's sort of a motivation part of it. And the idea here is, so if you think about hypermedia in terms of hypermedia controls, we really only have two that we can build things with, right? So links and forms. I think it's a testament to how powerful hypermedia is that we could build so much of the web with just those two things. The first 15 years of the web, that was pretty much it. There was some JavaScript, coming along. And we built quite a bit of useful functionality with just those two hypermedia controls. And so what HTMX says is, okay, why should only anchor tags and forms be able to issue HTTP requests? There are two elements, but what makes them special? There are other elements that you might want to issue a request based on. For example, a button is an obvious one. Like, why can't buttons issue requests? Also, right now, the way the HTML specification works, you can only issue what are called get and post style methods. And so HTTP itself, the protocol actually supports additional HTTP methods. So there's like a delete request and there's a put and a patch. You have these other options. And so HTMX says, okay, not only can anything make a request, but also they can make any of these types of requests. And then finally, the sort of like last big piece of the puzzle is, why should, when you submit a request, why should you have to replace the entire viewport? So why not make it so that rather than replacing the entire viewport, we can just replace some chunk of the current document? That's actually not a new idea. That's called transclusion. It's been around for a long time. So there's a lot of academic work in the hypermedia world around that notion. And it actually exists in HTML, believe it or not. So there is an attribute on links and forms called target. And you can use that attribute to target an iframe and only an iframe, which is interesting, but it makes it a pretty limiting thing in the overall scheme of things, because iframes, for better or for worse, they have this historical baggage associated with them. And so what HTMX says is, okay, anything can issue an HTTP request. It can be any kind of HTTP request. And then in addition, the hypermedia that comes back, and this is a big distinction between HTMX and, say, React, is HTMX expects HTML to come back from the server. That HTML can be placed anywhere in the DOM. And so there's a couple of ways you can specify exactly how that happens. Oh, and excuse me, I missed one other concept earlier. There's also the notion of the event that triggers the request. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about anchor tags or links, a click triggers that interaction. And when you're talking about forms, a submit action triggers that. Well, there's a bunch of other actions or events that occur in an application that you might want to have some interaction with the server. And so HTMX also makes it possible for any action to trigger a request. And so that ends up being the sort of four generalizations of HTML that I talk about. So any element can issue any type of request in response to any event, and it can place the response content anywhere in the DOM. And so I know this might come across as arrogant, but I like to say it completes HTML as a hypermedia, in that it sort of fully generalizes this notion that I think is super important of hypermedia controls in HTML. So that's the sort of philosophical basis of HTMX.
Right. Again, our listeners are quite familiar with frameworks like React and Vue and so-called modern frameworks, right? Now, obviously, there's a server-side focus to HTMX and there's a large client-side focus to these frameworks. But beyond that, at a more deeper level, where do you see the divergence? Where do you see the compatibilities? Where do you see the,
Yeah. I think the big thing is really hypermedia. I'll keep saying it. And that's my reason I've really focused on it. Like my essays page, I have a lot, and I've said this on other podcasts. I think the essays page is probably more important than HTMX as a library in the long run, because it's got a lot of ideas around hypermedia, and it really is a different way of building web applications. As Fielding noted in his dissertation, it's a different way of building applications. The hypermedia systems work differently than non-hypermedia systems. And I would say a lot of the web applications that are being built today use thick JavaScript style, talking to a JSON API. It's funny that some of those actually are more like the 1980s thick apps that we did, right? Like JSON is the new Corba or whatever, is the new data exchange standard that we have. And it's very loose and whatever, but the way those applications work with the backend is much more like a thick application from the 1980s than it is like a web application from, say, the 1990s or early 2000s, the sort of traditional web application.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I don't want to criticize people for going down that. When it first happened, it was because the hypermedia approach with only links and forms had a lot of usability issues. I don't know if you remember like old online email clients where every time you clicked a button, it was a full page refresh, and you had to wait, and like a little dinosaur came out and like did a cartwheel around a star or something like that. And, it was charming in its own way, but it does not have the sophisticated feel of a modern application to it.
Yeah.
So people very reasonably said, okay, well, JavaScript is here, and then JSON and AJAX, the technologies that sort of like form the basis of a lot of applications today, came along, and they said, okay, now we can achieve better usability. We don't have to have this big, kerchunk or whatever every time I want to do an action. So that was reasonable. But when that happened, we also, and I think at some level inadvertently, sort of left behind the advantages of the hypermedia approach, because we were going back to more like thick style apps. And so HTMX, what it does is for a certain class of web applications, it allows you to achieve a better user experience while still staying in that original hypermedia model. And so it's not a good answer for all applications, because hypermedia isn't a good answer for all applications. But I think it does significantly increase the number of web applications that could be built using the hypermedia approach. And so, and also just like as an aside, I think the hypermedia approach is interesting technically. So even if you're not sold on HTMX, just understanding the engineering aspects, particularly the uniform interface and this idea of decoupling at different levels, I think is worthwhile for web developers.
Right. Before I dive into more of the internals, something I wanted to ask later, I can ask that now. When would HTMX not be suitable or not be the most ideal choice for you?
Yeah. I've got an essay up called When to Use Hypermedia, I believe, where I go over some, when is it a good idea? When is it a bad idea? But basically, if you have interactions that drive a lot of requests, like really fiddly interactions. So an example application is like Google Maps, where dragging a mouse implies a bunch of UI updates. That's something that you don't want network latency to be hitting every time someone moves a mouse. That's just not a good user experience. And so that's probably something that wouldn't be a good application to address with HTMX. I do think you could maybe do the settings page for a map application in HTMX, where it's just a more traditional, here's a bunch of toggles and inputs or whatever, and then the user fills them out and clicks save. That could be done very effectively. And that's sort of like, in my mind, the ideal application for HTMX is sort of form-driven applications, because there's a lot of think time and the user interacts with things for a while, like interacts with local controls for a little bit and then click save, and they're okay because they've done a bunch of work. So they almost feel better if it's not instant. I don't know about you and your listeners, but I'm not a big fan of settings pages where there's no save button, where it's like you just set it and then did it save? Did it change? Like, am I good? Do I leave? Like, what's going on? That's an example where it's not even necessarily like application versus application. It could be as simple as just what's the feature I'm currently working on, where you might choose hypermedia over a more sophisticated approach like client approach.
Sounds good. Sounds good. I was thinking more about the HTMX attribute set, right? To help control a lot of the client-side behavior and interactions. But there's also a big focus or big advantage of using HTMX from the server-side perspective, from the backend perspective. Can you talk about how HTMX integrates with the server-side of the application development pipeline?
Yeah, so one thing that's different about HTMX is that it puts a tremendous amount of focus on the backend. Because the backend is producing the UIs for your web application, now the backend becomes a much more sophisticated, a much more integral component to your application. You shrink down the amount of code that's in the front end, and that code tends to be in HTML, which you don't write. And again, I'm sorry to jump around a little bit here, but in HTMX, you don't write JavaScript for the most part on the front end. When you're just using the straight HTMX functionality, you're typically just putting attributes on HTML to say, okay, this button issues a request to this URL and then takes the result and puts it in this place in the DOM, simple things like that. And so what that does is it puts a lot more logic on the back end. In particular, if you're familiar with older web development, you go back to templating or some sort of HTML building tool technology on it. Your front end gets built on the back end. And because of that, what that means is that a lot more of your code is going to be written in whatever backend language you're using for that system. So if you are a Go programmer, then rather than having a large JavaScript application that talks to a, maybe medium-sized Go application, what you're going to have instead is a large Go application that uses maybe Go templates or something like Temple or something like that to produce HTML. And then everything kind of lives on the back end, or it feels much more back-end focused. And I think that's a good thing for the following reason in particular. First of all, let's say a couple of reasons. First of all, if you're a Go programmer, switching back and forth between Go and JavaScript probably isn't something you want to do a ton of. You're going to have to do a little bit of it, but HTMX will help minimize that so you can really focus in on the back end in a much more focused manner. And the other thing about it is that because you don't have a large JavaScript application on the front end, something that you've seen in the last 10 years is tremendous pressure to adopt JavaScript on the back end, because then you're using one language. Why would we have, if we've got a big JavaScript system on the front end, why would we have like Go or whatever on the back end? So if you use HTMX, it takes that pressure off because you don't have a big JavaScript on the front end. What that does is it opens up the potential backends, I think, in a way that if you adopt a large JavaScript framework for your front end, you're going to feel this pressure. Like, why aren't we using JavaScript or at least TypeScript on the back end? And with HTMX, you don't have that pressure. And I like that because I teach the compilers class at Montana State, and I like programming languages, and I like lots of different programming languages and the cultures that grow up around them. I felt like it would be a shame if the JavaScript juggernaut kind of steamrolled all these other languages just by having the advantage of being there on the browser side. And so I think HTMX helps address that and can help people, if they want to use a particular programming language, they can use it on the server side. It does push a lot of problems that you have on the front end to the back end. So how do we compose UIs, for example? A lot of people who are used to React are used to React components. So the way you can address that is via UI reuse on the back end, which if in a traditional templating system, that might be template inclusion, but they're back end component systems that are growing up as well. So it shifts your problems to the back end, which I think is a good thing. Everything else being equal, it's better to have your problems in one place rather than two places. But that's maybe a subjective claim.
Fair enough. I mean, I certainly have felt this problem where there's a pressure to kind of use the one language that's decided by what's in your front end, right? And it can get a bit uncomfortable.
Right.
One thing here in this pattern, how does it differ from the BFF pattern, like the backend for front end pattern?
Could you give me a quick overview? I've heard BFF before, and people have come at me with the term before. Could you give me a quick overview of it so I can?
Sure.
I just want to make sure I feel like I understand what it is, but I don't want to speak incorrectly if I have a bad understanding.
My limited understanding is that just like you would have your data layer and your application UI layer, you might have a layer or an API that determines what the UI model should look like. If a forms page needs a object list, 3-4 entities, it'll be the collecting layer for the front end.
Right. Okay. Yeah, my understanding of it, again, I'll just lay out, if I'm addressing the wrong thing, I apologize, but this is what I'm going to try to address. My understanding of backend for front end is the idea that there's backend code that is tied to your front end needs. in the form of objects that maybe model it. And then also you see this idea that you should split your application API and your pure data API up, right? They should be two different endpoints. So like general purpose people who want to consume, a general purpose data API have one set of endpoints, and then your application has another set of endpoints. And I think HTMX speaks to that in the following way. First of all, I agree that you should have your web application API and your JSON, your data API split up into two separate components. And I would say further, if it makes sense, that your application API should maybe be in terms of hypermedia using something like HTMX. Because hypermedia makes a bad general purpose data API. You don't want to be pulling down HTML from some website and like trying to figure out what the HTML is. That's just not what it's designed for. So I think the reason you see people advocate for this split, though, in the JSON world, even if you have JSON APIs, there's this pressure for this split between what my application's doing and what the general purpose data API is. I assert that that is there because there's a fundamental tension between your application needs and the needs of general purpose data API. So general purpose data API needs to be stable, number one, right? Because people use it. And so that's why they're typically versioned and so forth. So it needs to be stable. It needs to be general. It needs to provide general data access to like whatever possible reasonable needs might occur. It also needs to have things like rate limiting. You don't want to let someone just hammer on your data API and so forth. On the other hand, the application API tends to be much more churny because your front end changes so dramatically and so quickly. And furthermore, you have specific needs for a particular UI, and implementing the fetches against a general purpose data API that might be necessary to get that data could be really expensive. When instead what you could do is on the back end, sort of collect everything that you need for the UI and just send it back in one chunk. But you don't want to do that in your general purpose API because now it's not general purpose. It's for a particular UI. So I think what you're seeing there is this tension between the need for a general purpose API and the need to respond quickly and have very efficient queries for your UI needs. And I assert that in many of those cases, if you can get the interactivity that you need out of it anyways, using hypermedia for your application API rather than JSON will give you even more advantages because then, with hypermedia, you sort of have the ideal interaction with the server in that you issue one request and you get back the entire UI and that's it. So you don't have these like chatty interactions where you're, hitting a bunch of different endpoints to wire together all the data that's necessary. You also send the ideal amount of data on the response because you're sending the UI. You don't send any extraneous data. And so if you're using a general purpose data API, very often you're getting back data that you don't care about. Like you just need maybe a couple fields to build out a UI. And so I think from what I understand of it, the back end for front end idea is sound. I just would add, and by the way, the front end might be hypermedia. And if you do that, to me, as an old school guy, I would think of it more as model view controller. That's just, maybe I just grew up on it. But I would just think you want to have two different controllers, and then they talk to a model that represents your domain model. And your data API, which won't change very much because you've taken the application churniness out of it, can just work against a very generic, model, return table. Just return things as JSON. JSON serialization is pretty simple. And then your application controllers can be tuned and they can change a whole bunch as you change your UI because it's a hypermedia API. So you're not trying to satisfy two sets of people with it. You're just, this is for your web app. And so I think it's a good fit philosophically for that problem. I don't know, again, the details of backend for front end. I'm not super familiar with, but to me, it feels like a good fit for certain types of applications facing that.
No, you touched upon it pretty well. You talked about churny applications, and that obviously brings us to managing state, right? Obviously, in client-side heavy applications, state's kind of somewhat simpler to manage in one place. So this shift in burden, how does that change? How does that make it easier or harder? And what are the performance characteristics of this?
I would take issue with the idea that it's simpler. It's a local cache, right? It depends on the application, of course. But for most web applications, what you have, if you're in an SPA and you're a single page application, a JavaScript heavy application, you have a local cache of what the data on the server looks like. And your listeners are probably familiar with the adage that there's only two hard problems in computer science, right? Like naming and cache invalidation and off by one errors. And so, cache invalidation isn't trivial. It's not trivial. And one of the dramatic simplifications from a distributed application standpoint of hypermedia is that the hypermedia, there's a term for it. Hypermedia is the engine of application state. And so you have a representation of what was on the server when you made the request, but that's it. And so all the state is actually encoded in the hypermedia. So I think, again, I don't have a ton of experience building super complicated single page applications or JavaScript heavy applications, but I understand that it can be tricky to, what do you do when the server gets out of sync with the client, and how do you reconcile those things? Those are hard problems that to an extent are diminished when you go to a pure hypermedia model and you just say, look, the server is the source of truth and you're going to make a request. We're going to respond with the new state of the system, and that's it. So there's a big simplification from state management when you adopt hypermedia. There are disadvantages as well. So you have to make a server round trip to indicate like, okay, I've updated the state. What do things look like? And that's in contrast with a JavaScript based application where you might update the UI like immediately and then make a request and wait. And then that request will update the server later. But I would point out in that case, that's called an optimistic update. I would point out that when things go wrong, that's good on the happy path, but it's bad on the sad path where maybe that update couldn't occur for some reason. So an example I often give is, and because people complain, hypermedia-based applications, like I can't buy a ticket on the subway because the signal goes away or whatever. I say, okay, sure. But at the same time, do you really want to be told that you got a ticket and then find out later on that you didn't get a ticket? Because it seems like the source of truth for whether or not you got a ticket on that thing or to that concert or whatever is really on the server. And even if you just cache that request and wait till later, like what if your phone dies and you think you've got a ticket or whatever? It's all trade-offs. There are certainly trade-offs associated with hypermedia. I think it does lean on the server more heavily. And on view operations in particular, if every single interaction causes a GET request, and those GET requests are slow, then the application is going to feel slower. On the other hand, a hypermedia-based application doesn't require that every click actually interacts with the server. So a good example of that, if you're familiar with the details element in HTML, is a details element it's just a standard tag in HTML. If you click on it, it'll expand a details section. And that's an example where an interaction, a click, is not, even though it's still hypermedia based, it's not interacting with a server there. And so this idea that every single interaction has to have some sort of server request is not true. What is true is if you update the state of the system, then that should be done via a hypermedia request with the server. It's kind of a subtle distinction. And it's one thing that's a little frustrating when I talk with people is that I really try to, there are a bunch of trade-offs here,
It's interesting because one of the clear trade-offs is how much interactivity you want and how much consistency you want trade-off for that, right? The example of the fully SPA application where you optimistically update the state, it could be wrong, only to be finding out about it much later on in some other way, right? And again, going back to how this affects performance, for example, where is the performance shifting? Who are you robbing to pay for who?
Yeah, 100%. And this is an area where I do sometimes get a little frustrated because my experience with single page applications has not, particularly in the presence of like unstable network connection, has not been uniformly amazing.
Yeah.
I've seen plenty of spinners in single page applications in my life. So, okay, you can put a spinner on a page as well. HTMX has support for what are called request indicators. You can put a spinner on a request just as easily in the hypermedia approach as you can in the single page application approach. And so I feel like they're tricks. Yes, if you need to be offline, if your application absolutely has to work offline, then the hypermedia approach probably isn't a great one for it. But people have remarked, and actually a part of our essays section has some examples of people that have moved from React to HTMX and had much faster applications with much lower memory usage and so forth. And so I think the simplicity, what makes something fast? Being simple, right? More complicated you make it, the slower it's just inherently going to become. And so the simplicity of the hypermedia model, I think, helps in that regard.
Okay. What about browser support and compatibility? I think you mentioned earlier, HTMX is trying to evolve HTTP of sorts, right?
Right.
So how should we think about this?
So HTMX is interesting because HTMX, it's currently in 2.0. And in the 1.0 line, we still support Internet Explorer 11. And so there was, for a long time in the project, an almost sort of stubborn, like, we're going to support the old stuff because no one else is doing it. But in 2.0, we said, okay, look, Microsoft declared Internet Explorer dead. We'll stop doing that and we'll simplify some of the stuff, simplify some of the implementation hacks that we had to put in to work around Internet Explorer shortcomings. So at this point, I would say HTMX it's very compatible. The 2.0 version is very compatible with the vast majority of browsers that are out there. On the other hand, when new features come down from the browsers, HTMX tends to introduce them, but not necessarily make them the default. And so there's a conservatism to HTMX when it comes to adopting new technologies because, and the reason for that is that I think the core idea of generalizing hypermedia controls is that's what HTMX does. People have tried to push HTMX in like different directions. Oh, it needs to handle this, it needs to handle that. And I've really tried as much as I can, and I haven't always been successful. But I've tried to keep it really focused in on just generalizing hypermedia controls. So I think that makes it a more conservative with respect to like the newer browser features. It makes it more conservative in that regard. And that probably lends itself towards backwards compatibility. So someone can pick HTMX and be pretty confident that almost any browser they're going to encounter in the wild is going to work with it.
Can you give an example of one of those things that's in high demand, but you're being cautious about it, and why?
Well, I would say, what's a good example? Like Vue, if you've heard of the Vue Transitions API, which came out about a year ago in the browsers.
Briefly.
Yeah, so Vue Transitions are a new API for basically taking one UI and then transitioning it, as the name suggests, into another UI. And HTMX supports that. You can use them. You can turn it on in HTMX, but it's not available in Firefox. And so we don't use it by default. So you have to select to use it. Instead, HTMX uses CSS transitions, which have been around forever and are supported in all the browsers. And there's a bunch of code, which is kind of junky, I have to admit, to make that work, to make CSS transitions work, because they don't work easily unless you do some additional work. So that's a trade-off that HTMX would make is, okay, let's support, we have this kind of, okay, it's a little crazy internally the way that it works, but for the end user, it makes CSS transitions work properly without them having to think about it. Versus tearing that out and saying, okay, use Vue transitions and start yelling at the Firefox people to support it.
Interesting. Looking at a couple of advanced features, I'd like to understand out-of-bound updates, a bit more, and what the security implications are, and what should we developers think about, and how.
Yeah, so out-of-band swaps are an interesting idea. I just sort of like came up with them, and they've taken on a life of their own. There's a lot of features in HTMX that people either love or hate. And out-of-band swaps, I feel like a lot of people love or hate HTMX. It's an interesting psychological aspect of HTMX is that there are a lot of people that love it and there are a lot of people that hate it. So not too many people that are indifferent towards it. But even within HTMX, there are features that a lot of people love and a lot of people hate. So I don't know what the situation is. But out-of-band swaps, what those are in the normal sort of functioning of HTMX, here's how a user would use it. They'd have a button, they put an attribute, AJAX get, for example, /to-do/1 to get the first to-do. And then they're going to have another attribute on that button that says, okay, AJAX target equals, say, hash output. And what that's saying is I want you to take the result of the HTTP GET request to that URL, and I want you to put it into the element with the ID output. That's what that's a CSS selector, if your listeners are familiar. So that's what it's going to do. What out-of-band swaps let you do is when you make that request and you go and you get some content and you put it into that output element on the page, they let you also include another thing, or not many things, as many things as you want, basically additional elements that will be swapped into based on their ID, and you can use a CSS selector again for this. And the stuff that will be updated is elsewhere in the document. So you sort of break this direct relationship between the button, the request, and the target, and you allow people to start sending content to random places on the UI. And what I like about that is that it obviously increases what you can do with a single request because you can piggyback on these other updates with the request. What I dislike about it is that it makes it harder to understand what the hell is happening because you've got the main content coming down and then this other content that's being scrolled away in different parts of the DOM. But it is a very powerful mechanism, and it lets people continue to use the hypermedia approach in situations when, if they didn't have out-of-band swaps, they would probably feel pressure to adopt a reactive approach in order to update more than one place at the same time. So to give you a sort of a canonical example of when you would use out-of-band swaps, if you want to update, like we just said, you want to get a to-do and put it in some element somewhere on your UI. And at the same time, you want to flash a message to the user. So you might send a flash element in the response as an out-of-band swap, and that'll pop up and maybe show for like 10 seconds or something like that. That's sort of a canonical usage of out-of-band swaps. So it just allows you to update more than one place at the same time with a single HTTP request.
Almost like firing off a Go routine to do something.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know Go routines. I don't know Go that well.
No.
I'm ashamed to admit I'm a Java programmer.
No, sorry. So, or firing off a new Java thread and not worrying about what it's doing.
Yeah, it's what's a good metaphor for it? Boy, it's hard. It's like if you were sending a present to your aunt and you included a bill for your uncle or something. I don't know. I'm struggling with a good metaphor here, but it's very useful. And I'm always, like I said, I'm a little uncomfortable with it because it breaks the traditional model of a hypermedia control makes a request and updates one thing, but it's proven useful. So,
can these out-of-band updates trigger further updates, kind of like a graph of updates?
Yeah, they can. And that gets at the fact that HTMX is event-driven. So you can listen to events and, if something updates, you can issue another request. The content that comes back can also, inside of it, have additional HTMX code. So a really basic use case for HTMX is you have a div, and that div has an AJAX get to some URL on it. And then the trigger is load. And what that means is put this div into the UI and then immediately trigger another HTTP request to get the inner content for it. And that implements a pattern called lazy loading, which can be really useful for making a response fast, the initial response fast, and then the thing that takes longer, you can have a spinner and show the user, but the user can interact with the content sort of right away. That's a technique that is very commonly used in HTMX applications. So that's an example of something. You could do an out-of-band swap with something that then has lazy loading inside of it, or infinite scrolls, another thing you can implement with HTMX.
Interesting.
Whatever. So yes, those events can then trigger further requests very easily. There's also a way to actually trigger using HTTP headers to actually trigger events on the DOM, and then you can listen for those and trigger requests as well. So it really is a Swiss Army knife of hypermedia. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. It is very unopinionated, which some people don't like because you have to kind of figure things out sometimes. How do I want to do it?
Is there a risk of this triggering infinite updates or infinite triggers? And is there anything you can do to kind of put correctness checking in this somehow?
Yeah, there is for sure. One thing that you'll often see when people first start out with HTMX is they'll have a button and then they'll click the button and then they'll get back an entire web page. And now the entire web page is inside the button. And the button looks ridiculous.
Yep.
So there are dangers. It's not a strongly typed, hypermedia is not strongly typed. And I think at some level you just have to accept that. There are systems that are in place to do static verification of not only HTMX, but just hypermedia links and forms, which have to an extent the same problem. I mean, you've probably been in an infinite redirect loop at some point in your life. But fundamentally, I think, you have to accept a little bit of this is just, you got to do it right. So,
it's just software engineers being software engineers.
Yeah, you just got to do it right.
I want to jump into some real world implementations, success stories that you heard of, what challenges they might have faced, what the impetus was. Are there stories you want to share?
Yeah, there's the story. The whole reason HTMX started getting popular was because of a talk that was given in, I think, 2022 at DjangoCon Europe. So Django is for listeners that don't know, is a web framework, very popular in the Python world. And an engineer at a French company, gave a talk about HTMX called From React to HTMX on a real world SaaS product. We did it and it's awesome. And as the name suggests, they had a really good experience with this. So they're a news site. It's Contexte is the name of the company in France. And they had a React-based application that they were building to show news items with some pretty sophisticated filtering and so forth associated with it. And they were in a bad spot. They had a team of 5, I think, or 4, but they had one front-end developer and then sort of a lead developer and then 2 back-end developers, if I'm understanding correctly how their team was laid out. And they were really struggling. They were not making progress. The application was pretty slow. And the lead engineer decided, hey, I'm going to try HTMX. So he tried to use HTMX for it. And I have to say in advance for listeners, I don't want to oversell HTMX because their application was ideal for HTMX. They're a mostly text and images sort of that's media. This is hypermedia wheelhouse, And so them using HTMX really was well suited for their particular use case. But they did a rewrite of their React app and it took them 2 months. They had the same user experience that they had with their React application and they reduced their code base size by 67%. So 2/3 of their code went away. That went from 21,000 lines of code down to like 7,000 lines of code. So just a massive reduction in complexity in the overall. So there's no way you can lose that many lines of code and not just have like a huge weight lifting off your chest. They reduced their JS dependencies. So HTMX has no other dependencies. You can use it without even using Node Package Manager or anything like that if you want. So they reduced their JS dependencies from 255 dependencies to 9. They reduced their build time for their web app from 40 seconds to 5 seconds. Their first time to interactive went from 2 to 6 seconds down to 1 to 2 seconds. And the way their application works is people often click a link and go directly to a particular what sometimes people call deep links, to a particular page or URL in their site. And so that first time to interactive is really important for them. That was a very big deal to them. They also were able to handle much larger data sets because they were relying on the browser to show a table or a list or whatever instead of React, which is trying to synchronize a shadow DOM with the normal DOM and just has a lot more stuff going on. And so by just relying on the browser, they were able to show a lot more data to their users, which led to a better user experience. And then finally, the last sort of bullet point that we've got up on the website is they reduced the memory usage of their website by 40%, which is a big deal as well from a performance standpoint. So it's a very dramatic success with HTMX, and it is moving from React to HTMX. But I want to temper that by saying their application was very amenable to the hypermedia model. And so what I think that indicates is that there are a lot of people that think when you do a web app, you have to use React. And that's not true. There's a large class of web applications that can be addressed very effectively and often in a much simpler way using the hypermedia approach. So that's an example of a pretty big success.
Great. I mean, for teams, looking to adopt HTMX and obviously replicate the success of this company, what would be some of the migration strategies that can help them be successful and avoid pitfalls?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I'd say is don't switch to HTMX just because you heard me talk about it. It's like if React is working for you, stick with what you got. So let's talk about non-technical things to consider. First of all, if you have an app that's working, don't change it. If you have an app that's not working, okay, maybe now it's time to start thinking about whether or not this other approach will help. The reality today, again, from a non-technical standpoint, is that the standard front-end technology is React. And if you're concerned about hiring and you want to make sure that you've got a good pipeline, a lot of people that know the technology, then React is, no one ever got fired for using React at this point. And HTMX is very simple to learn. Most mid to senior developers, even very junior developers, I think, can pick it up pretty quickly. But it's much less opinionated. And so depending on what your backend is, you may have to figure out the patterns that make sense for your particular application. And so there's a little bit more freedom. And with freedom comes danger there and then unfamiliarity. And I hope that's being addressed because HTMX is getting more popular. HTMX won the JavaScript Rising Stars for web frameworks last year. So we actually finished ahead of React in the number of stars on GitHub for as much as that's worth. But it's a big deal to me. So I think it's starting to get mind share. And we have a book called Hypermedia Systems that's at hypermedia.systems that's available online for free to help people learn that stuff. But I don't want to say, there's danger there. It's not the standard. And so anytime you're not using the standard, you're taking a little bit of a risk. One advantage, I think, to teams is if the team wants mainly to be full stack developers instead of having this front end back end split, then HTMX can be a really good choice because HTMX moves the front end generation to the back end. And so your developers become much more full stack. I often say I think the most powerful HTMX developers in the next few years are going to be people that understand the web, so front-end type people, but who also know how to use SQL, because that's like the most powerful technology on the back end. And if you can tie those two things together, which you kind of see them trying to do with GraphQL, but they can't quite do it because you just can't give SQL to the front end. You just can't do it. But if you're generating your front end on the back end, you can use SQL to do that. And so you can have access to both these very powerful tools. So I think that's another thing that they note when they transitioned at Context Day from React to HTMX is that everyone on the team became full stack. And there's a big advantage to that, sort of, again, not technical necessarily, more sociological, which is that people, they tend to own features rather than parts of features. So rather than a front-end person fighting with a back-end person about an API change, they just do what they want. They're writing SQL, they just change the SQL. You don't have this, well, okay, we're going to get to that change in 2 sprints, and then 2 sprints later, like, oh, it's got to slide another sprint. And at that point, the front-end person has forgotten about the feature or whatever. You're much more as an engineer in charge of a feature from full stack, from the front end to the back end. And that can be a much more efficient way to work. So advantages, there are advantages and disadvantages. I do want to stress that at this point, and I tell this to engineers too, oh, should I learn HTMX? And I say, well, if you want a job, you should learn React because React is the standard. But if you have a job or if you have a project and it's not going well in React or you want to give another approach a try, then I think HTMX makes a lot more sense.
Fair enough. You mentioned HTMX not being opinionated means that there's a lot of opinions. So what are some of the good backend patterns or architectural patterns you're seeing emerging that are showing promise?
Yeah, I think the old patterns are good. The good old patterns that we used to have. So I programmed in Rails for a long time, Ruby on Rails, and there was a real strong notion of models and views and controllers. And I think model view controller is a really powerful way to organize your software. So the ideas of hypermedia and the uniform interface, I think, are interesting. You kind of get them by default. That's one of the nice things about if you use hypermedia, if you use HTML to be more concrete. I don't know if you're familiar. In the 2010s, for a while, it was like super popular to argue about whether or not an API was RESTful.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember this. Right?
I do.
So everyone, he's like, it's not RESTful. It's level 1, level 2 of the Richard maturity, whatever. And to me, that was all super alienating, and it felt like kind of puritanical. Like, oh, you didn't do structure. But the nice thing, if you just use HTML, if you just return HTML from the server, your API is RESTful just by default. Almost like it's very hard to make it not RESTful. So I think that's one of the interesting aspects about hypermedia is that it takes a lot of these things, they just evaporate. Like, how are we going to synchronize backend and front end state? Well, we don't. It just goes away. Like, that's a whole layer of code that you just toss. And, now there's obviously that whole layer of code is doing something. So you lose something there. And that something that you lose is that local cache of remote data and maybe the optimistic updates and so forth. And so there are trade-offs. And I think you have to make some trade-offs when you're building things with hypermedia. There are times when in many applications, you might want to do it one way and you have to do it maybe not as sexy, not as cool a way with hypermedia and accept maybe an additional request, or maybe it's a little bit like you click a button to save instead of things updating automatically or whatever. But I think if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to make those trade-offs, then you can get a bunch of simplicity. You can get back. You can drop a lot of complexity. And any software project, as everyone listening to this podcast knows, involves there's a complexity budget. And at some point, you're going to go bankrupt with complexity. And so you need to be kind of frugal with what we're going to spend our complexity on. And so being able to give up and just say, not give up's maybe the wrong term, but to accept, okay, this isn't going to be as cool as it might have been in React, but it's good enough. It does the job. And because I'm willing to make that statement, I get back a tremendous amount of complexity that I can then put into, say, the back end code somewhere where it's more effectively spent. Maybe it doesn't matter if I can drag and drop contacts in this UI, although you can do drag and drop in HTMX. There's an example for that. But again, I think being willing to trade off a little bit of front end sizzle for saving a complexity can be a very good trade-off in many cases.
Would this be a software engineering general problem or React versus HTMX kind of decision-making thing, right? Where can something help you in advance know where this complexity might be when picking between HTMX and React?
Yeah, it's hard. I think, and maybe it's an existential choice, right? Maybe you have to pick. Maybe you have to pick to see the choice. And I've seen people say this, and I can't say they're wrong, where they say, why would I pick HTMX when I might need React? And then if I do get into a position I need React, now I've got to rewrite it. And I would respond to those people in two ways. Number one, I would say there's the engineering principle, you ain't going to need it, right? YAGNI. And so in general, we've said before in computer programming, like you shouldn't worry about the future too much. Like obviously you have to make good architectural decisions and the rest of it. Again, I do have an essay where I try to lay out like, here's the shape of an app that's probably going to be pretty good for HTMX. The second thing that I'd say to those people is that, to get back to what I was just saying, like sometimes you can just say, no, we're not going to do that. I think front end people sometimes, and I don't blame them, they're focused on the front end. They really want to achieve a particular user experience. But there are times, I think, when you have to ask yourself, is that user experience so much better than just like, say, a stupid form with a save button, that it's worth all the additional complexity to achieve it? And sometimes that answer is yes. And sometimes that answer is no. And if you're willing to say no, then that, again, expands the class of applications that can be addressed effectively with HTMX and can save your complexity budget for other stuff. Third one is that you can use HTMX in combination with another technology.
Right.
So HTMX is relatively lightweight and not hard to figure out. And I know people have used React or Vue. For example, I think Contexte actually uses a Vue for a rich text editor where they're coordinated, where it's like an interactive text editor with two people editing the document at the same time. And so they said, this is too crazy to do with HTMX. And I agree 100% with that. So we're going to use a Vue component to make that happen. And I think that's absolutely the right thing. That's absolutely the right thing. So these aren't mutually exclusive approaches either. Now, the counter argument to that is like, okay, well, now I've got two technologies that I have to understand. And I agree with that. Like at some point, if you find yourself using React all over the place and just, you're going to have to make a decision. Okay, like maybe we'll just drop HTMX then. So it's all trade-offs. And unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. So I can't, even knowing a project pretty well, I can't necessarily say that HTMX is going to be 100% the right choice at all times. I do think it's the right choice in more situations than most people suspect, because I think most people underestimate what you can achieve with hypermedia and with HTMX at this point.
Going off from migrations and adoption, right? How do you see the developer experience side of HTMX? I mean, given simplicity, where do you see the developer experience pain points are, advantages are, recommendations are?
Yeah, there's only 12 million attributes to HTMX. So like how much developer experience can you possibly have, right? But the major IDEs are supporting it. There's language servers now for it. And it has, some syntax in some of those attributes. So, but I think the developer experience as it improves isn't going to be an HTMX proper. HTMX proper is not going to change very much for the next, 100 years, I hope. But instead, what it is going to be is it's going to be improvements in server-side code for managing hypermedia. And so just as an example of tools that I think help, there's a concept, again, I'm sorry to keep referring people to the essays page, but there's a concept called template fragments. So a common way to build hypermedia systems in the past, right, was to have templates. And so you'd have some Java or whatever. Go has templates in it if you're familiar with Go. But Python, whatever you're using, and then you would have an HTML template, which was sort of an HTML-like file with some special syntax in it for doing loops or whatever. And one technology that we've sort of advocated people put in is a notion of template fragments, which is the idea that you've got a template and you want to be able to mark a section of that template as this is a piece of template that I want to be able to render independent of the enclosing template. That's really helpful, I should say, for HTMX style applications, because what it lets you do is have one template with all the stuff in it, and then you can sort of see everything in one place, right? You don't have to get into this world where every single little snippet that you want to update dynamically has to get pulled out to some other template. And now you've got to navigate back and forth and try and get into your head what's going on. Instead, you can have one template or fewer templates anyways in the overall system, and then use those snippets within that bigger template to respond to HTMX requests for a particular update or whatever. And so that's an example, I think, of a tool that will improve the developer experience for HTMX. And I'm happy to say a lot of people have added this functionality to their systems because of that essay. So it'll improve the developer experience in server-side frameworks, but it's not really HTMX itself that's changing. It's instead thinking more like, okay, how do we want to do things on the server side to produce hypermedia effectively? So that's where I see developer experience going. Oh, and also for any listeners out there, I wrote a book on HTMX called Hypermedia Systems, and it's pretty philosophical, but it's sort of in Python, and it intentionally uses a very simple web framework called Flask. But I think because HTMX is unopinionated, there's an opportunity for a bunch of books that are more opinionated and are like, here's how to use HTMX with X. There's a book out on how to use HTMX with Spring and Timeleaf. But basically, if you're interested in writing a book and you're passionate about a particular backend system, I think there's an opportunity for pretty much every for every application or application server or web server language pair to write a book on here's how to use HTMX effectively with this particular backend tool. And that's a weakness to an extent of HTMX. It's unopinionated. It's a strength and a weakness. So it means anyone can use it, but it also means that you're going to have to figure it out. Like, how does your system work?
Be the pioneer.
Be the pioneer, be the change you want to see in the world. There's a lot of good ideas. So I would, highly recommend people, even if they don't like Ruby, to get familiar with Ruby on Rails, because there's a ton of really good ideas in it. That's a system that I would say has been really honed to a fine edge when it comes to producing hypermedia. And so I think there's a lot of really great ideas in there. Django as well. But again, there's an opportunity there. But it's something that I think I just have to admit, it limits the HTMX ability to sort of take over in any particular area. So HTMX has done really well with Django developers. It's also done very well with Go developers. And I think that's because the Django people already had everything they needed except for a front-end system. Django had everything except for that. And then the Go people are so used to just writing everything from scratch, because that's just the Go culture, that they were like, oh, cool, I can just write everything from scratch like I always do and do it my way. And so, I think HTMX sort of resonates with those communities really strongly because of that. I've had this interaction before online where a JavaScript developer who's used to server-side JavaScript and all the generators and all the tools, and you just type, npm run make my app and it generates 1,000. They look at HTMX and they're like, where is everything? Well, that's not the idea.
Where are the batteries?
Yeah, that's not the HTMX thing.
I mean, I can resonate that coming from a Go ecosystem. Looking at the community, the future, and obviously the growth has been phenomenal. How has this ecosystem grown since you first released it, and what are the trends you're seeing in terms of the adoption and community engagement?
Well, so it's grown really, really rapidly, particularly since July of 2023 now. So in July of 2023, two online influencers, the Primogen and also Fireship Dev. Primogen has a daily show. He does development and so forth. And then Fireship Dev, he does these sort of 90 second, I forget. It's some 3 minutes. It's a very quick and very well produced introduction to some technical concept. And they both happened to cover HTMX. Primogen, I would say, more got into HTMX. Hypership Dev covered it right at the same time. And that happened to be right when we released our book, which was dumb luck, because that book had actually, we had been in contract with a publisher to publish it, and they had canceled right at the end. They canceled it, and we were like, oh man. So we had gone back and rewritten it. So the whole timing was just extremely dumb luck. But it worked out so that there was a huge boost in interest. And you can see that if you go look, again, the way for better or for worse, I use GitHub stars to think about the popularity of something. And there's definite elbow in July of 2023 where it just started shooting up. This is a serious podcast, and I have to admit my online behavior there's a lot of antics. And I enjoy that, but I can't necessarily recommend it for everyone. But that has turned out to be very effective on social media for the last year and a half. And before that, maybe let's say the last 2 years, in getting attention and so forth. And I gave a talk at Big Sky Software called A Theory of Open Source Marketing, where I sort of talk about my experience of going through that and just what happened, how did this happen, and some ideas. So listeners can go and check that out if they're interested in more on that. But I would say the HTMX, the vibe is very lighthearted and lightweight. which is a good thing. And that's in general my approach to life. I don't take things super seriously, but at the same time, I do have a paper that was ACM published paper on hypermedia controls. And so there's a mix of serious content and joking content that I think has been very effective for HTMX.
Talking about joking content, one of the criticisms of HTMX is that HTMX is really a big ploy by big HTML to take over, JavaScript frameworks. Right. How would you respond to that?
Right. How would I? They're not wrong. No, that's JavaScript is part of the web. I don't know. People have they have a problem with proportion, right? Everyone wants an either or, and they don't like talking in ands. Yes, ands. There's an essay, again, I'm sorry to keep referring to it, but there's an essay called Hypermedia Friendly Scripting. So scripting is okay. Scripting is okay in a hypermedia-driven application. So JavaScript is okay. What's not okay, or what makes something less of a hypermedia-driven application, is when you start having side state that lives outside the DOM and is updated in some other way and whatever. So I don't think HTMX is anti-JavaScript. I gave a talk at JS Nation this past November called HTMX is pro-JavaScript, kind of like saying how I feel like HTMX can be interpreted as being pro-JavaScript. And the core message there is that HTMX makes the amount of JavaScript you have to write much smaller. That makes each line of code of JavaScript more valuable, and therefore JavaScript is more valuable. But you are writing less of it in general if you're using HTMX. But, again, I love these discussions. I love that. I love the back and forth on Twitter is where I usually spend most of my time. But I have definitely heard criticisms that the antics on social media might hurt HTMX in the long run. And they're probably right. But at this point, the graph is going up and to the right. So I don't know what to tell people. And I try to mix in the serious content with the jokes. I think you have to have both.
You got to have both.
I couldn't be a buffoon on Twitter only, and I couldn't be an academic only, but I try and mix the two together. Seems
it's time we have a funny academic.
Right. Well, humor, we all know it. Humor works. It's very effective, right? This has been known for a very long time. I said this on the Primagen at one point. Joking is what is it? Humor is not a joke. Being funny is not a joke. You have to work at it because it's a really useful skill. So, but anyway, I don't want to
as we get to the end, how can developers get involved? Beyond just using it, how can they actually help it grow? How can they help contribute to it?
The code base itself is pretty stable. So I don't think direct contributions to HTMX are going to be it's going to be hard to do a direct contribution, particularly a big one. At this point, we're kind of in the sanding phase of the library. And so we're just trying to maybe sand down the rough edges. But I have seen people come in and do testing, more ad tests that have been really effective. And I appreciate that. It's one of the most valuable things you can probably do for software is ad tests. On the other hand, because HTMX is so unopinionated, again, there's an opportunity for writing books about HTMX and a preferred backend, a preferred technique that you've come across, but also building up libraries in languages that are designed to work with HTMX is something that someone could do. There are a bunch of those that are, but I think there's still a lot of opportunity around that. So I think those are the major ways if you want to contribute to it. But there's also, just reading the book. If you have a philosophical bent, understanding hypermedia, there's always new ideas that can come out of. I really like this idea of going back and looking at old systems. There's so much cool stuff from the 70s and 80s that people have forgotten about. And I think going back and looking at those old ideas, you can find a lot of really good inspiration. I've been on a kick. I've been reading a bunch of Nicholas Wirth stuff from, the 80s and 90s.
Nice.
I don't want to say I don't agree with him. That's he's operating at a level far beyond me. But it's just really good to see, someone really smart thinking about things at the level that he is. So
fair enough. Sounds good. Thank you. Do you have any closing remarks?
Nope. HTMX.org is the website. It's for front end, hypermedia driven front ends. There's an essays page /essays if you're interested in more philosophical stuff. There's a lore page, so /essays/lore if you want to catch up on the social media aspect of the whole thing. And hypermedia.systems is the book. There's a hard copy, a soft copy, a few different digital editions, and then you can read all the content online for free on the website. And also we've uploaded the EPUB to LibGen, so you can find it on LibGen for free if you don't want to buy it. So Those are the main places I would point people. I guess one other website I should mention, just because some listeners might find it funny, is grugbrained.dev. So that's a web page really that I put up with sort of some observations about software development that people might find funny or infuriating or whatever. So
Thank you, Carson, for being on Software Engineering Radio. For our listeners, you can find the links to everything we discussed today, including HTMX, its documentation, community resources, as well as examples in the show notes at se-radio.net. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.